In at number 10, we have got the Megalosaurus, and this creature is just so full of great abilities, and compared to maybe something like the Rex or the Spino, this creature really doesn't get as much as I think it deserves to in actually how much damage this creature can do, and what this creature like really can do in terms of like it can really pack a punch in any kind of battle scenario. This creature does hefty amounts of damage, which most people probably don't even think of, as they just think, well, this thing sleeps in the day, it must be completely useless. And although there is a slight hindrance to that, I still think it is well worth it, because in the night time these things are so vicious. If you're on operation, then you're going to have a pretty easy time with this thing, because obviously it counts as nighttime all the time, so you can use it all the time. But still, on every other map, they're really great for boss fights if you want to do that with them, and they can even grapple small creatures in their mouths, and they're pretty good alpha killers as well. And they're alright at caving as well. Maybe they don't fit into quite as many caves as the Baryonyx, but they still do fit into pretty much all of them, as you know, they're quite a decent size, and they're pretty decent just like general traveling mounts, and really good, like they're really good at also defeating the dragon actually, which is a point which I should add, because these things can kill the Dimorphodons very easily as they can grapple them in their mouths, and it's actually a pretty decent boss strat, which I would definitely recommend you doing as long as you have high enough level Megalosauruses, because you know the dragon's particularly harsh to some carnivores. Now, some of you may kind of be hating on me a little bit for putting this better than the Megalosaurus. I don't maybe think that this is a better creature than the Megalosaurus. It's just for what it does, it's more useful for the general Ark player. But personally, I would go for Megalosaurus over the Castorides. It's just the Castorides is such an insane gatherer of wood. I have to put it higher because wood is just such an essential resource in Ark, and also you can get using it earlier as well. It's easier to tame because it spawns in a much nicer environment, and it's also a pretty good underwater mount as well, and you can gather quite significant amounts of energy paste from the beaver dams of this thing. But there is the next creature on the list, which I think is a significantly better way of getting all of that cementing paste gathered, of course. And these things also have a smithy as their saddle, which, you know, a portable smithy if you want to repair any of your metal items. Not really as useful as on the RG, but, you know, it's still a really nice thing to have. And I actually remember when this thing came out, and then that feature was there, and it was actually a pretty cool thing. Although, again, like I've said, the RG, it makes more sense for that creature, as it's this creature's not going to be the one to transport loads of metal around. Next up, we have got the Beelzebufo, and this creature is, in my opinion, just so overlooked. Like, people don't, like, they'll acknowledge this creature, like they'll look at it and they'll just be like, well, it exists, but I'm never going to use it. Like, what's the point of this thing? I have beaver dams for all of my cementing paste used. Like, I don't need this thing whatsoever. But the fact that this is, like, it's just, it really does have an extremely great use for me, because obviously it's a really great cementing paste gatherer, and until you've used it, you probably won't know actually how good this thing actually is, because you're probably just like, well, beaver dams do it all for me. And I'm going to say they don't. You can gather just so much cementing paste with this creature. It's absolutely insane. Like, with the insect cave, especially on ASA actually, as insects don't have levels anymore, you can get thousands, if not tens of thousands of cementing paste in one run, which will probably encumber you, but still, you can really gather just so much of the stuff, and it's pretty decent underwater as well, which again does play quite a nice big benefit towards it. Next up, we have got the Quez in at the number 7 spot, and this creature is just one of those where I kind of just have to include it, like, instinctively. I feel like people just severely undervalue and overlook the Quetzal for what it actually is, because it doesn't need to be the fastest flyer out there, although maybe you might say it's really boring to just fly around on a slow flyer. If you build your base near to a mountain, then you're going to be fine, and it's no slower than something like a raft is, and people use that all of the time, and you can gather, well, not gather, but carry so many resources with this creature. And when you have a platform saddle on top of it as well, you can have your own portable base there, and although maybe it might move slower than you want it to, you can still get a heck of a lot of resources across the map in quite a timely fashion compared to some other smaller creatures which will go faster because their weight isn't big enough, so you need to take several trips, or even some creatures which can, but then they're on land and they tend to be a little bit slower, and obviously you're in land as well, you'll be dealing with many other obstacles, while when you're in the air you can kind of just go in a straight line, so that's why the Quetzal's here. Next up, we've got the Crystal Wyvern, and I feel like people really undervalue this creature. I know it's an overlooked tier list, but I will say undervalued a lot in this, because they're kind of similar of each other. Overlooked is like to kind of over, well, like skim over something, really, is kind of the general definition. And with a creature like this, I think people just devalue it for its tame method compared to the normal wyvern, because it's so much easier, so therefore this must be so much worse of a creature. Well, this thing is pretty much, I'm pretty sure actually, it's just the same strength as a wyvern, and with the blood crystal wyvern, it really does prove an extremely useful one with all the main features of a wyvern. Just, you get actually a nicer ability. The blood crystal wyvern by far has the nicest ability out of any wyverns out there, and they also have the hydration buff, although maybe not the most useful because they're flyers, but you know, you ever stick their feet in a little bit of water, or you get those wings to touch water when you're actually flying over a lake, you can get that hydration buff, which again is going to buff you. And you can also use these things in the boss fight of Crystal Isles, so they must be pretty strong to actually like be useful in that fight, and they definitely are. So you really shouldn't undervalue these things for their tame methods. And I know there are a few things which make it a little bit more annoying, because the primary crystals are a little bit annoying to get, and the level 65 like starting level can be a little bit of an annoyance, but trust me, once you get those things down, you're really going to have a good time with these creatures. At number 5, we have got the Megalodon, and in my opinion, this is pretty much my favourite underwater creature to use just for like general combat and all of that. And yes, a Mosasaurus is going to be great and do all of that, but I find that a little bit too big and bulky for me, and the Megalodon is just a sweet spot. And I would say the Basilo's not really an overlooked creature, which is why I haven't included it on this list, is it's a really great creature, and obviously it doesn't get hurt by the electric eels and the jellyfish, which does play a huge benefit. But I feel like people don't give the Megalodon enough credit for what it actually deserves, because it really is a powerful creature, which does have an alpha variant, so it means Wildcard did definitely care about it when designing it. And when Ark actually came out, this was like one of the only ocean creatures actually in the game at the time. And also they deal the bleed ability as well, which again does play a huge factor when it comes to damage dealing of these creatures. They can just deal a lot more damage because of that bleed ability, which makes them pretty good combat creatures. And if you're thinking of doing the Moda on Genesis Part 1, as always, just tame yourself an X-Megalodon and you're going to have yourself a blast of a time. Obviously you're not going to have one, you're going to have multiple, but I find they kind of do better for that boss fight, the Modas, because they don't get stuck in the whirlpools as much. Next up, we have got the Vonaur, and this creature is essentially a portable turret, and I know there are a couple of you out there that just really don't like this creature or value it, and you know, you can be that person, but still, for me, I really like this creature. I find its abilities quite cool and inventive for me, and it's quite useful to hit creatures from long range. And you might think it's a bit gimmicky when you first use it, but then I'm at a stage now where I really like it. And with the Vonaur on Gen 2, you can have an even more powerful version. Obviously, you wouldn't use the kind of spikes this close, but I'm just kind of generally showing you a demonstration. And sadly, they don't scale when you level up melee damage, only the melee attacks, but those melee attacks are pretty hefty as well. And again, with the size of this thing, it makes it a pretty decent caving creature as well, which you maybe might not expect, especially on Extinction actually, because those caves are really big and you can just quickly get through them. Obviously, you're not going to be doing any of the Titans with this creature, because it's nowhere near as powerful as something like a Giga or a Carnosaurus, so it probably doesn't really have too much of a chance against the Titans. But against pretty much everything else in Extinction on other maps, actually, you can even use it for some boss fights on some other maps, although maybe wouldn't recommend it the most. They really do pack a punch, and they're pretty decent for some PvP scenarios as well, although I'm mainly a PvE player. Next up, at number 3, we have got the Bionic, and this creature for my uses is the go-to caving creature, and I feel like people don't give this creature enough credit for what it actually can do, and just resort to creatures like the Shadowmane because it's the newer creature that's just like the better one, supposedly. And I do admit the Shadowmane largely is better than the Baryonyx, but still, that thing is significantly harder to tame than the Baryonyx, and a lot less accessible as well. And I still kind of like to go back to my nostalgia-y roots, which you might think is maybe a little bit crude of me, but still, when I think of this creature, I think of caving, and when I think of the Shadowmane, I don't think of caving. And I have done some caving with the Shadowmane, it's just, for me, it's not as enjoyable. I know that's not really a valid excuse, you just want a really good caving creature, but the Baryonyx really can do that. And again, it's really great at underwater caves as well. You might think, well, the Shadowmane is just better at underwater caves then, because, you know, it's a really fast swimmer and good in the water. Well, this thing kind of has a slight edge. It doesn't have the hydration buff. Kind of think it should, to be honest, considering the Spino has it, and it's kind of Spino-like. I know it doesn't have the spine bit, but, you know, it makes sense. But yeah, it can stun creatures up to the size of a Megalodon, like you've seen there, so it's a really nice, useful ability for it to have. Now, I'm really one for the Carno, and that's why I put this creature in at the number 2 spot, because this creature is just so overlooked in my opinion. People always go for the Aloe, and yes, now on ASA the Aloe and the Carno pretty much as easy to tame as each other because of the new baby like taming methods thing, but still the Carno in my opinion is just the more preferable creature to me because it's smaller, still deals a lot of bleed damage. Obviously the bleed damage is the same regardless of what creature, but it deals the bleed damage like the Allosaurus, and although maybe it doesn't have the pack buff and all of that and it isn't quite as powerful a creature, I still think its smaller size, it really just nets it as the better creature for me, and also the level that it's unlocked. I know they're still quite similar, but I still think this is kind of my goal for first carnivore in Ark, and I feel like people overlook this creature for something maybe better that you might want to use instead, and you can obviously go for those creatures as well. But again, I know it kind of comes back to nostalgia a little bit, but I do feel quite nostalgic for this creature. They're some of the first carnivores that I ever tamed, and I still really like using them, and obviously they did have their TLCs and all of that stuff, so they're a lot better now than they used to be, but still I think people just really overlook them and don't use them as much as I think they should be used, as they are really good creatures to use. They're really easy to control, and they deal that bleed damage again, so they really do pack a punch in 2024, so I don't really get why too many people aren't using them, unless everyone's just for some reason going for the Aloes every single time, which, you know, you could say is quite valid, and it mainly just depends on personal preference for that. At least in my opinion, it kind of depends what you want more of a carnivore. Do you want like a smaller carnivore, a larger carnivore, what kind of ability you want, and all of that. Damage and health, you probably just want the highest, but yeah, the Carno's in at number 2. And in at number 1, we have got the Blood Stalker, and maybe necessarily I don't think this creature's overlooked, but the reason why I've actually put it in at number 1 spot is what I use it for. I think people overlook it for, which is why I've put it in at this spot. And in my opinion, the Blood Stalker is the best underwater creature out there, with no exceptions to the rule. It is just miles ahead of any other creature which, you know, maybe might have some slight competition against it, like maybe the Basilo or the Facilosuchus when that thing actually comes out. I'll make my opinion on that actually when it releases, when Scorched Earth comes out, of course, and also like creatures like the Shadowmane and all of that. You might say they compete with it, but the Blood Stalker is just, it's so versatile in all it can do. It can glide across the top of the water. Again, the Maven can as well, but in the water it's really fast and agile. You can also seal the creatures, so it's kind of like having an awesome Spyglass mod, but you don't actually need the mod, and you can see the aggro of creatures. You can actually see if creatures are aggroed onto you, if you need to get away from them instead of just staring at them and seeing what they do next. You can see if they're aggro to you. They actually, usually when creatures aggro, they'll either attack you or just run away for some reason. Don't know why that really happens, but you know, I get it happens when you get them to high torpor, but even if they don't have high torpor, sometimes creatures will do that. RKI is a little bit weird, to be fair. But yeah, the Blood Stalker, in my opinion, is the best underwater travel mount, and I think it's really overlooked for that, and it's just seen as a good like traveling mount, and it's good for getting hexagons on Gen 1 because, you know, there's missions that use it and it's a useful creature to learn, but I don't think enough people use it for those underwater abilities, which I really personally love this creature for.
And give it up for our patrons, Ekaterina Puchkova and Karina Thorne, Dominic Maciejewski, sorry about that name, and everyone else that's on this list. All the people I've mentioned are paid members, and if you feel like that's something you want a shout out at the end of the video, go join the Patreon or become a paid YouTube member.